I'm pleased to introduce today Dr. Lindsay Crowshoe from the University of Calgary. Dr. Lynden or Lindsay Crowshoe is a Peigan First Nation family physician scholar with experience leading large multidisciplinary research teams focusing on chronic disease and social equity within areas of primary health care, public health, and health education. He is an associate professor within the Department of Family Medicine and Assistant Dean Indigenous Health within the Office of Indigenous, Local, and Global Health. He has leadership experience developing Indigenous primary healthcare service systems and policy, provides national input on Indigenous primary healthcare, and has led multidisciplinary Indigenous primary healthcare teams, both on reserve and in urban contexts. In his approach, he bridges multiple disciplines of knowledge, including health, clinical, social sciences, professional health education, and Indigenous ways of knowing. With regards to diabetes, he leads a national research project, Educating for Equity, E4E, intended to enhance patient and clinical outcomes with Indigenous people with diabetes. This project builds knowledge of complex social influences of colonization on diabetes and how culture is a critical factor in healing and well-being.
What are those colonial factors and what are those ways in which the social determinants and all that interplay with diabetes and Indigenous people, and what is our role as healthcare providers to make sense of this? I challenge that healthcare providers need to go beyond a biomedical lens in working with us as Indigenous peoples, that there are key sort of and very complex but accessible components to this that are part of our job, and we're not explicitly trained to be able to focus on this, and so that's my motivation is to have something that we can hold on to that becomes a way that we engage with Indigenous people to address that reality. So part of that reality is central to this is relationships and good approaches to that. So I will go to the next slide. So generally speaking, when I come to our audiences, I'm hoping that you will be able to sort of understand, maybe describe even, maybe talk about, maybe apply these social determinants and how they impact the diabetes outcomes with us Indigenous peoples, and start to hopefully more than define. These are certain formative learner concepts that I put in this presentation. These principles and concepts and approaches for integrating these things that I'm saying that are located in social and cultural sort of contexts. So the argument to that is that I forward is that there is a comprehensive care for Indigenous people with diabetes, and it needs to contain these things, and maybe needs to be the front of these things, maybe need the focus of these things. Inherently, I'm speaking about how and this goes beyond diabetes, this is in general, that structural inequities have created health inequities, right? And in order for us to move forward, we need to understand these upstream things as clinicians in order to help and work and be a helper with Indigenous peoples to address these inequities that we face day to day, right? So I think we need to understand this at that level, and that's the concept of structural competency that we need to have at play that is part of patient-centeredness. We also need to not forget about the calls to action, and I highlight the call number 18. My call on all of us as health professionals is to look at these things and interpret what this is saying for us in the context of our clinical world. This first one, and all of them, if you look at them, seem to be speaking to organizations, institutions, big sort of higher level of structures of society. But it also speaks to us as healthcare providers. In this one, it speaks to those upstream things that really are factors in what we are experiencing as Indigenous peoples. And if we do not have that knowledge or those skills to help support and facilitate and navigate with that person, Indigenous person, we may not be doing as effective a job as possible. part of the job to understand is the lay of the land in terms of epidemiologic trends. I know that this is Alberta-based stuff. I ask you to look to locally what prevalence rates are and trends are within with Indigenous peoples in your community, so that you know what the context of the work that you're working in. We do know that there's distinctiveness between Indigenous populations and non-Indigenous populations. We see a higher prevalence rate, we see a gender difference, and those are things for us to really be aware of and ask the question, why is there a gender difference in our community? Why is it that Indigenous women carry a higher burden of diabetes? What does that relate to in terms of the burden from colonization on women, and how can we do a better job from a gendered perspective? So those are some big picture thinking, and I think those are things that we need to ask ourselves as clinicians when we move forward. Not just to, we got to be aware of the clinical components to it and kind of practice guidelines and all that good stuff. But I ask us to have these big, broader social questions as kind of what drive us. Because colonization has impacted Indigenous peoples all throughout the world. This slide is a very blurry slide, but it shows hemoglobin A1C differences for Indigenous peoples all over the world. This was some looking more, there's a bigger, broader table that this comes from, but this looks at the high rates within a few contexts. We got to have more knowledge, of course, but we need to do the best that we can. Ontario has been moving forward in their knowledge in terms of understanding the epidemiologic picture of diabetes, as well as the clinical aspect of diabetes care. So this speaks to there's distinct differences with Indigenous peoples in Ontario. So collectively, you have to pull this knowledge together. The outcomes are not so good. Here's some more Alberta-based stuff. This is I don't know where you're from, and what knowledge is there for you to access to be able to know the lay of the land, and then to focus your resources and your clinical focus. But in Alberta, we sort of align some data from provincial administrative data in concert with relationship with the Alberta First Nations Information Governance Center and First Nations Inuit Health to be able to pull together some big picture things so that we can help drive our systems, because without this knowledge, the healthcare system does not respond. But nonetheless, that's a whole other conversation. My conversation today is to think about those social factors that influence diabetes and how they may do so, and ask, so what are they from your perspective? What do you do about them? How do you integrate care? So I think those are questions that in a live format, I'd love to be able to hear. I don't know if people can shove things into the chat box for this moment. I'm having trouble seeing if there's a chat that I can access to be able to see any feedback from people. Is there, Jessica?
There is a chat box. You should be able to click it open by clicking the chat button at the bottom of your screen. There's nothing much in there at the moment, but I do encourage people to go ahead and drop their thoughts in if they've got any.
So in the spirit of thinking and adding, those are my first two questions. What social factors influence diabetes in your viewpoint, and how do you provide care that integrates or addresses these factors? Because that's what I'm going to work through. I'd love to know what you do and what you see, and your ways of supporting. So I will provide a uncomfortable pause here for a moment while you reflect.
So one person has responded and said, first was the outlawing of our traditional ceremonies that kept us strong and healthy. And her second answer is incorporating the mind, body, and spirit, weaving and braiding these together.
Yes, so that is a story that I speak through when I speak about the historical determinants of my people's health. I actually have to work through this from my community's sort of historical records. We do this winter count thing, and I'm from one of the Blackfoot reserves, we do this winter count, and we would write a pictograph each year that the community said, yeah, that's really the most important thing that happened to us, and we can't lose that. So there's a pictograph and then a narrative that's connected to it that was placed on a buffalo hide, and each one of these were consecutively drawn more of a helical frame on that buffalo hide. And I go back to that document just to hear the stories and understand. And those are strong parts of what I bring to teaching, and what we have to do as healthcare providers is understand that deep historical connection. Access to natural foods, yes, I see that. That's great. I gave this berry talk. I was asked by this One Health sort of idea where it's an integration of sort of biosciences, medicine and healthcare, and vet care, and they asked me to do a talk, and I was being kind of cranky and felt I'm tired of giving academic talks. I'm going to give a fun talk. So I gave a talk on berry picking, and thinking about berry picking and bringing my kids and family and what it means for community and what it means for social context and big picture ideas. The fact of keeping community and family active and integrated in meaningful things, because berry picking is a very social endeavor, and historically it brought us together. So I see social economic status. Yeah, that's definitely some of the things, how your family eats, how your community eats, those are all big factors. So these are contexts that are really important for us to go through. So let's look at some of the slides that I put together. So old stuff, gotta have better new stuff, haven't found better new stuff. But we do know that the income gradient drives diabetes in dramatic ways. The origins of this knowledge comes from an international research project that I was the lead for the Canadian component. We wanted to understand the impacts of professional education of chronic disease regarding Indigenous peoples. We wanted to know the clinical outcomes, and so we teamed up with Australia and New Zealand, and I focused on diabetes because I wanted to understand, and I could see the connections of all the social drivers that is located with diabetes. I wanted to understand that in an Indigenous context, and it seemed to be an equitable space for us to explore these things. And in that search, knowing that there are many social determinants that frame this, but diabetes is such a great way to understand it. Income is a big one, and so you can look all across the world and see this trend, and we can find newer stuff from Stats Canada, but this is just a nice slide to show that for all peoples, income is a huge driver, and we can understand income is not just personal income, but there's a community held sort of resource that we need to hold on to in this. So, and we have to start thinking of what does that mean for our patient, and what does this mean for my role. There's another context concept that we have to think about, and it's adversity, right? We can speak about historically we've had trauma. Historically we've had many reasons to have trauma, forced dislocation, on reserve, restricted rights, having no rights whatsoever, being sort of dependence on the within the Indian Act, without our sort of citizenship and power and privilege, and then the experiences of residential school. And what does that mean for diabetes? And what does that mean for outcomes? Those are things that we're just starting to make some sense of. You know, the ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experiences Study in America, which is coming from an HMO, which I think is a great concept with sort of 12 domains that they saw were connecting various types of adverse childhood experiences to clinical outcomes within an American population. There are some Indigenous people that are doing research that see different indicators, but nonetheless, it's all good work. This slide is about thinking about childhood adversity in the context of a parent-child disconnect at a very young age. That's what this speaks about. So, and it shows that there's a BMI, obesity, and hemoglobin A1C difference when there is a fundamental disconnect. And this is not Indigenous. This is like this is UK data. So this is a phenomena all over the world that I find resonance in my own community, in our own community as Indigenous peoples, that the disconnect of parents and child thinking about residential school and that intergenerational trauma effect has created a situation that might be even more pronounced for us as Indigenous peoples. Central to this is a concept of toxic stress. So all of these things coming together, whether it's resource disparities or adverse life experiences throughout the lifespan, racism, all that stuff are fundamentally adding up to a cumulative stress. And stress can be good. A bit of stress gets us over that hump. We got to write an exam, study hard. That's stressful, but that heightened sort of psychosocial, cognitive load says, oh, you pull it all together and you do the job, and hopefully you hold it all in your head, and your study habits are great. Excuse me. Sometimes that stress can be quite intolerable, and that's where we need to understand and locate those things from this big picture within, and how we then need to help people to understand and navigate sort of the impacts of colonization. We know that there's been emerging knowledge around that sort of interconnection, right? There's this theory which had kind of has begun to frame that epigenetics concept that we also need to know more understanding of. Excuse me, guys. But Bjorn Torp proposes that there's this connection of physiologic stress or stress in general that translates to a physiologic stress. Is also connected to a mental health component, and talks about the interconnection of the pituitary, hypothalamus, and adrenal axis, that the stress sort of contains ways that what physiologically produces, like what we see here in terms of our load in our body, then generates some diabetes outcome. So there's that shows the biomedical interconnection to this colonization stress, and those are things that I hold on to and ask us to hold on to, and ways that we talk about this stuff with patients as well, because I find that Indigenous people want to know. We understand things, we want to make sense of it, and these conversations are important whenever we can facilitate them. Within the work that I do, I think that it's important to think about and always sort of talk about where do we position this knowledge, and in the decolonizing sense, right? Because if we are reclaiming our bodies, reclaiming our power, reclaiming our capacities as resistance, as resilience, as restorative to colonization, a restorative justice lens. So this is the social sciences a social justice look and lens that I think we have to have and hold as healthcare providers and researchers and Indigenous peoples as well. Excuse me, is that we have to think through this in terms of how do we push against the man that's causing the problem. Gerald Vizenor is an Indigenous academic scholar, and speaks about survivance as a concept that is gaining traction, at least in my world, and many of the people that I speak to, is that these stories, this narrative, the ways that we frame our world are speaking about how we resist and shift and become very strong. And we have to hear those stories. Often, as healthcare providers, we try to stuff down stories too much to fit into our mold. And my direction, recommendation for us as healthcare providers is, in an Indigenous sense, the narrative is fundamental. The resistance in that narrative and the support of that resistance is fundamental for us to move forward as Indigenous people. So survivance is a central concept for me and the work that I think we should be doing in promoting Indigenous health and diabetes. So that's some big picture stuff for us to think about. I'd love to be able to share a case with you. I don't know if anybody's seen these cases, or this case in particular. This case actually comes from my E for E work. It is a meta-narrative of many of the themes that we were seeing with the people who came to the table to share their experiences of diabetes and diabetes care, because we felt that in the development of this intervention, the knowledge that just wasn't there in the literature, and so we had to do some explicit inductive based approaches to like understand, and then look to the literature and then understand more and look to the literature and help to interpret. So there was a very inductive approach to building this E3 knowledge. And within that, we had a lot of information that we analyzed and saw some huge themes, and we felt that we needed to respect those themes and those concepts. So we created a big meta narrative in order to talk through these things. So much of what you'll see in this case is kind of direct quotes and all that kind of stuff brought together in a package that we call Dorothy. Dorothy is a monologue, to be honest. She is using her inner voice. It's that voice that clinicians often don't hear if we kind of impose our kind of communication approach on them and our agenda. It is the voice that we need to hear, and it is the voice that gives us direction in terms of the patient-centered context that we have to be aware of and how to then develop great relationship with Dorothy. So I will play that video and give me a moment while I end this show and start the video. And if anybody has a great joke to tell or put in the chat that Jessica could read off, because last time I did this we had problems. I'm going to stop share and find that video, cue it up. There's the video there. And I'm going to share.
Just make sure that the optimize for video and share computer screen are clicked.
Will do. Optimize for video and share sound. And I see that. I'm going to share that. And so you guys ready? Okay, could you hear that? If you can speak, Jessica, I don't see any
I
chat.
haven't heard anything yet.
Oh no, okay. Here we go. Okay, just pausing there. Did you hear it and see?
Someone says that they hear it. I don't hear it, but everyone else seems to say that they do.
Okay. So everybody else, do you see a beautiful woman with a cool cup and some sweetgrass and a few things on the table? Okay, so let me just see if I can see the...
That some can hear, some can't, and some can see, but some can't.
I don't know what's going on. I'll just make sure this video is big. And it stopped.
We do have a funny story in the chat box that I can read.
Please
so
do.
Lucy says, a funny story. This grandma got up at an Indigenous diabetes conference to share her granddaughter's way of telling her to take care of herself. Cookum, don't you go eating any of that sugar or you'll get that sugar die by Jesus.
Oh boy, that's really great. I'm going to play this, and it's 6 minutes. So thanks for that story. Check the Zoom audio setting itself. Typically it works well. I'll stop it and start it again, okay? And we will share again. And it's optimized for video clip and sharing of sound. And let's give it a go. So Jessica, you don't see it though.
I see it now. Yeah, I see
Okay,
it.
Here we go. Here's Dorothy. So that's Dorothy, and I'm going to go back to my presentation. Apologies for people who could not hear.
Can we make sure to get that link out after?
Sure.
Perfect, thank you.
It is yes, it is a current research project, so it cannot be shared beyond this, right? Because we're doing research on its impacts on clinical outcomes.
I can embed it so it's only available for people who came.
Cool. So so where are we now? Let me get this presentation up and rolling again. Some of these days are hard to. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to share this presentation, and I am so like disappointed in the this interface today. It's hit and miss these days. Okay, so you probably will see my my version, right? Do you see that?
Yep.
I'm going to leave it at that because every time that I sorted it out, I did this, it was messing up. So the questions to ask, really, what resonates with you in this video? What are the social issues that you saw? What are the cultural aspects? How do they connect to diabetes? How do you support Dorothy in these moments? So if you have any comments to add, I'd like to see some in the chat box for the next few moments. Then I'll share with you a framework that I propose to help us to make sense of what Dorothy is experiencing. So I will pause for an uncomfortable silence. I actually think it's important to have this silence. It's fundamental to reflection. Otherwise, you just hear me drone on. Wish I could. So here's some silence. Okay, so a few breaths. We all had a few mindfulness breaths. Lucy mentioned that this is a story of our matriarch striving to be the backbone. It's my mom, it's my grandma, it's my friends' moms, it's all of our moms, and it's us, right? Yeah. So Dorothy is now not speaking. The video stopped. But the people who couldn't hear will give you some context from our conversation so far. Okay, so Dorothy is is an interesting character. We have other videos of this that that we use in our research to help to explore. This particular video is what we use to start a conversation. It is based in the framework that we saw within our data, which was both patients and providers as well as educators, that we call the care framework. Within the framework, we propose that there are a host of domains that we're accountable for, and that's sort of navigating kind of the elements of culture that we'll share, as well as navigating the context of colonization. Within central to this, we argue that there's two big moments, two big issues to focus on. And number one is recentering that relationship, because all of our relationships are defined by as Indigenous people within the healthcare system, this impact of colonization and the cultural viewpoints of which, say, the Indigenous person comes to the table, as well as those individuals that are not Indigenous and the culture of medicine or healthcare that are like, there are many cultures that are at play here. And if we do not center that relationship where it's focused on the Indigenous person and we just presume it's kind of everybody's the same and has the same mandates for relationships, we are not being culturally safe or culturally congruent in this context. So we propose just think about that recentering and knowing that colonization has impacted that relationship in deep ways and undermines it, and that we can perpetuate that as healthcare providers without even knowing, without if we don't look closely. But also we really need to look at that social reality that's focusing on what Dorothy's life. So those are the concepts of this E for E framework. We speak from a pathways of inequity to chronic disease lens. Within our data, we saw it aligned with what this slide is showing, that there's this resource pathway, poverty and hard work and lack of resources that all come about because of social injustices. There's a psychosocial pathway that I speak about that is like connected to that stress, that psychosocial stress, that colonization stress, the interplay of historical trauma and residential schools that seem to accumulate in our lives, right? And then there's this political pathway, which I'll focus on the political part, that is the embeddedness of these issues within our healthcare system of racism and all that kind of stuff. So we highlight this to providers so that they can understand the complexity of social domains, understand, like, if you look at a table of the social determinants, you'll see like many determinants, and how do you hold that in your head? Our frame was really highlighting that there's a pathway, a series of pathways that seem to connect to these ideas, and if you can hold on to those pathways, those are ways that you can think about supporting Dorothy, right? Dorothy in the context of who she is. Within the framework, we highlight there are some social domains that are like super key. We aligned with the kind of the slide before. You see that there's these resource disparities that are linked to this, and an accumulation of really bad life experiences or hardships that sort of build over the course of life. And within healthcare, there's some specific ideas that we saw of that political pathway that influences our healthcare system. So speaking to the first, it's not just individual, but it's also family and community resources that are not there, and it makes it very problematic and difficult. And our lives are hard. And so, what is it that we need to do as healthcare providers is the question. But also there's a knowledge component. It seems like there's a resource disparity of not physical resources, but also knowledge resources that the community was speaking to. So think about that. In terms of the adverse life experiences, I think that we've been exploring these sort of collectively across Canada and across North America for a while, but it's about individual and collective loss, and it's the residential school, it's the policy of assimilation, it's the Indian Act, all that kind of stuff. It's the hardships and the impact on the supportive environment. So think about this from a social cohesion lens. It has disrupted our fabric of society, and social cohesion as a social science concept to like think about and to like be a part of this. That if this is the big factor, what is our role as a clinician? And so those are some upstream things to think about. But more fundamentally, in healthcare, there's issues of power and unequal treatment and authority were key themes, and what is it that we should be doing to address the feeling, the expectation of unequal treatment. And Dorothy was explicit in her description of that, as well as the nature of power and authoritarianism within the healthcare interaction in the context of his historical traumas from residential school, or being like the policies of assimilation or the Indian Act, where we've taken our citizenship and our power away from us. So those are contexts to think about. In our framework, we highlight some key concepts of culture, knowing that there's some big, broad domains. We're seeing some key themes that seem to be held across the peoples that we connected to, and it's based in the concept of relationalism. So when I speak of relationalism, I speak of, when I hear people say all my relations, the connections of our mind or body to each other, to the creator, to the environment, the reciprocity, the process and pace, that degree of connectedness is what we're speaking to. We do agree there are many other cultural domains to speak about, but it seemed to be that the community was speaking about this is the relevant component to it. So we really focus on training non-Indigenous healthcare providers to think about relationality from an Indigenous lens. And what does that mean in knowledge exchange? And what does that mean in sharing of knowledge? And respecting that other person's knowledge as they come to the table, meaning respecting their story and understanding and helping to make sense of their context. Because part of the ask is that when we come to the table as Indigenous people, we are not just these receptacles of knowledge, but we are this person that is there in the room, and we're being human together, and we have valid and really important sort of things to share. And if you don't hear that from me as a patient, you're just stepping over me, and that's not what a helper is. So we have to abide by those concepts. So the last sort of component to this is the therapeutic potential of just culture, whether it is embedded, the possibility of being embedded within one's community from a cultural lens, and the historical stories of origin, the ways that tell us this is how we live, these are our principles, these are our ethics, but also engaging with the ceremonial or sort of traditional medicine world, which I argue are very distinct things, offer some huge protectiveness. So that's what the community was saying. So, and the role of what is the clinician's role in understanding and then fostering this. So that's kind of laying some groundwork here. We'll get back to more of the practical stuff. These next two slides just show that interface, this space. If we're thinking that we're trying to generate this equitable space, this restorative justice space in the way that we work with Indigenous peoples, or work together, there's a dynamic, there's a dynamism. And so as we are focusing on this directive of engaging that social reality, I'm asking healthcare providers to say, okay, there's a cultural set of frameworks happening, there's a cultural set of dynamics happening. You got to know this stuff, and you got to embed it in the way that you work with your patients. And you also have to know some really complex social issues that maybe if you know it, then you can actually engage in it and maybe find some supportive approaches in the way that you work together with your person. But if you don't know these basic frameworks, and you don't know a frame around it, and you don't know how it's interplaying, and you don't sort of place it within this domain of really the patient-centeredness, patient reality, you'll never do it. So this is the intent of that. And the relationality component looks much simpler, but it's definitely a dynamic process that it's a paradigm shift for Western healthcare trained providers to think about, what does that mean of reciprocity? What do you mean that I should share something about myself in order to set the stage for trust? Because in an Indigenous context, when I meet other Indigenous peoples, we share a bit about ourselves to see how we are interconnected. We self-locate ourselves in our community. We position ourselves so that there's an opportunity for me and that other person to say, hey, that's super cool. We have some connections, and we have non-connections here. That's super cool too. That type of interaction is not a Western interaction, and it makes Western trained people very uncomfortable. But that's the intent of this. How do you come to a place that is a reciprocity of not just who we are in that self-location context, but also of knowledge? The framework also asks you to do things that are shifting that process and that pace. Oh, that should be pace, not place. I got a typo. I didn't notice that till now. Anyway, so here's some concepts. But and fundamentally, in order to do that well, we still have to make sure that you understand this power and authority, power distance, power difference that we just implicitly have as Western care providers. There's this inherent thing that reawakens a historical experience of powerlessness that you have to be fully aware of and make steps to address, right? So in Dorothy's case, I'll walk through some of the ideas of Dorothy's case with you for the moment. And just to highlight some of these ideas, which you can find on your own by reading the papers. This is published as a paper. I probably have a citation in this presentation. But in Dorothy's case, we see social and economic resource disparities. She's the backbone. She's working hard. She has to work hard. She's supporting family. She's supporting herself. She's making sure her kids and grandkids have what they need. And that's the reality, and it's good. And she's a hardworking person, and she's connected, and but she's stressed, right? She speaks a bit. She hints at some adversities in her life, right? She hints at some adversities within the workplace, right? She hints at collective loss and family loss, and she sees her mom, and she sees herself in her mom in terms of the hardships that her mom went through, right? She sees a lot of hardships in being part of her family, but also that it's important for her to support. But does she feel supported in return? Are some conversations that can be had around Dorothy, and I'll show you some of the specific issues that we highlight in this. This slide is about what do you use this for? Like, why would you bother using this framework at all? And we argue that it's a motivational interviewing tool. If you don't know the lay of the land in terms of the bottom axis, the confidence, which are the barriers that one may have for change, you'll never help a person to make that change. If you don't know that Dorothy has some resource issues or materialistic issues, some psychosocial contexts, and some very political contexts that arise from colonization, you will never explore those with her. And then you will never help her to be motivated for shifting. You can hear in her story, she has motivation. That's the conviction axis. She's motivated to change. Her friend Gladys, with diabetes, with very similar symptoms, she's motivated for change, right? But there's many things in her way that block her. And if you don't see, if maybe you use Prochaska's stages of change model, that's cool. I totally endorse that. I say that a motivational change framework is an excellent framework to think about, because I can see elements of those social factors that get in the way to be clear pathways for us to work with Dorothy as part of my clinical role. So I'll walk through a few of the social issues that we embedded within Dorothy. And there's many, but I'll highlight a few. Okay, so social issue, and this is a concept around social cohesion, inequity, and poverty that we embed, and it's a big picture concept for all of us. I'll move through it quickly. It's the idea that, and I'll focus on social cohesion, it's the idea that our community is very important for us to be well. And in the context of Indigenous peoples, very true, super true. But it also has been frayed a bit, and that can be unsupportive. And so we're in this space that is supportive and unsupportive. And so let's look at that a bit more. This paper talks about that the complexity of social support in our community, and that we need to understand that, and that it's not just the psychosocial impacts of colonization, but it's also that sort of synergy with poverty at a community level that makes it very difficult. So we have to understand that a lot of the things that people were saying that in the research that we did to arrive at this was that family is really important. They can tax me. I have to support. And I feel supported by them, but it's complex, right? So that's kind of the nature of the quote right now. The possibility of support or lack of support and stress. It's a complex domain that we have to navigate as Indigenous peoples, right? So that's kind of a concept there. In that issue of family support was what we saw here in the broader literature. I don't know if you know of this concept. It's a population health concept. It's called effort reward imbalance. It's like if the amount that you do is like far exceeds what you get back, your health suffers, right? And so we saw this as a concept within our literature and our data as well, and we embedded it in Dorothy. And the concept here is that if you're stamping out everybody else's fires, how are you like feeding your own fire? How are you fueling your fire? You're going to burn out, right? And so that's a concept that we saw clearly in our data. and we feel that it's important psychosocial factor to share and explore with patients. And how would you sort of speak about this stuff to Dorothy, and what does it mean for Dorothy, and what does it mean from an Indigenous perspective? I think we can all argue that we're supposed to help each other. We're a collectivist culture. If we are selfish, if we are self-focused, that's very Western, and that's wrong, right? So Dorothy can, if Dorothy was your patient, she can say, Dr. Crowshoe, that's wrong. That's not an Indigenous way. And I would say back to her, Dorothy, it's true. An individualism is a concept that we see in Western society that we push back against, that as Indigenous people we push back against and say that is selfish and that's not how we live our lives. But at the same time, there's a truth here to explore. Maybe you need to save some for yourself. I recall when I was so I'm from Peigan Nation, one of the Blackfoot tribes. Growing up, in the Sundances, I was as a Brave Dog Society member, which does a whole host of things for the Sundance. The elders would say, "Oh yeah, you got a lot of work to do, Lindsay. Make sure that that you're rested, that you're ready to go. And this last day we have this big feast. Everybody's gonna get their face painted. You will be serving everybody, and this is how you do it." But and we got some great stew. We have like the holy Saskatoon berry soup as well, and lots of bannock and great food that everybody's contributed. So you will be working for the next few hours because all that food has to be shared, right? And there should be none left. But Lindsay, if you don't serve yourself first, what's going to happen? And I said, I don't know. Well, you'll have nothing, the elders would say. It means if you don't serve yourself first and put a plate aside and like a portion of the things that, all of the goodness that people have contributed, and you don't put it aside. So all of you crew of brave dogs and young people doing this job, serve yourself first, put it to the side, serve everybody else. When everybody's served, then you go help yourself. So if you don't make that balance in your life, you will be, you've been fasting for the last while. Every day you fast for the day, and you've been doing this work for the Sundance. If you don't serve yourself, you're going to not feel well. It's going to make you unwell. So serve yourself first. So there's also a cultural context of balance that from my own community that I've been struggling with and helpful for. But in this story of Dorothy, that's what I see in my patients, is this interplay of really wanting to stamp everybody else's fire out and not saving time for themselves. And seeing that that's an Indigenous way, which is so super true, but also we also have to take care of ourselves at the same time. So there's a conversation to have with Dorothy. I'll show you the next sort of concept that we place in Dorothy's world, right? It's lateral violence. There's I haven't integrated it. I see that Amy Bombay has described a new paper around lateral violence as its origins from residential school. It's part of that fabric of society that is being disrupted, but also rebuilt in better ways. She was experiencing some problems in her workplace. That is, she was speaking about that makes it hard for her to cope. Like she didn't want to go to the doctor. She didn't want people to know about this. It is the part of the accumulation of toxicity, and it was a big theme within our research across Canada. And we feel it's important just to highlight it and understand it, and then help people to understand it in the way that we engage with patients, right? So you probably know of this concept, so I probably can move along. I do find that many Western providers don't understand this concept. Although lateral violence is rampant in all of our societies, it's rampant in the medical culture, right? There's like this lateral violence amongst the different professions in which family medicine gets the brunt of it because we have the least amount of training. So I see it explicitly within my own sort of profession. I see it interprofessionally between doctors and other healthcare providers. I see it within our system, from policymakers and government people to healthcare providers. So leadership to policymakers, there's this hill of adversity that people sort of push against each other, which I think is unhealthy, which drives me crazy. And the more that we understand this dynamic and this phenomena, the more that we can create this safe space for us within our healthcare system. Because as a team, if we perpetuate this, how are we going to address it in working with patients? So we need to fully understand it and own it as people, and make sure that we don't facilitate it. So there you go, a soapbox. So Jessica, what is my timeline? At one time I had an email that said it was 1 hour. Then I see in the invite it was 1.5 hours.
Yeah, I just gave it a little extra time for questions. So if we want to take questions, I think 2:30 will be about our.
Yeah, I had other meetings booked at the same time, but I told them that this session was 1.5 hours. So what, we're good?
Yeah, we're good. We've got about 20 minutes left.
Okay, so I'll end this presentation and soon, and we can just have questions and chats and all that kind of stuff. To be honest, there's so much to explore, and I do lots of work in other domains and connect all of these things together. Dorothy highlights some key components that I think Wilkinson is a population health. He's non-Indigenous, and I think he's cool though. I like him. I appreciate his work. He speaks to that at a societal level. Societies are healthier if there's social cohesion, right? So thinking about our own communities, to what extent do we have strengths in social cohesion? We have tons of strength, right? We collectivistically, we're like awesome, but also we've been frayed. Our fabric has been frayed by colonization. That makes some of our parts not so helpful. Those are the things that we have to navigate and negotiate and understand with our patients. Inequality is a concept that he speaks to. If there's inequality within a population or a society, that translates into poor health outcomes. And colonization has imparted this inequality concept, that there is inequality throughout all structures of society, that Indigenous people, as well as other people of color, experience day to day. That translates into poor health outcomes. But as a result, all of Canada is impacted. The health of all in Canada, the health of all Canadians are impacted by inequality that is directed to all parts, any parts of our populations within our system. So the social justice lens is here. We have to address that inequality. The last concept is poverty. If there is a group in a population that is experiencing poverty, while there's a broad spectrum of people that are super rich, that is first of all inequitable. That's injustice, but also it influences more broadly the health of the entire population. Indigenous peoples are in that category of poverty amongst a very wealthy nation, and that's a conversation to talk about. And what is it that we ought to be doing as healthcare providers? This is a slide that I often use as a challenge for all of us. What do you do in these domains clinically with your patients? What do you do in these domains maybe organizationally within your healthcare unit? What do you do broadly at a societal level? Because we do have a role as healthcare providers to be advocates. How do you harness these things? So that's a bigger picture talk, right? It's beyond this stuff today, but it is a concept. It is a direction, and it's a challenge that we have to live up to. I think, at least I feel I do, and I share that challenge with other people. And I make sure that we know concepts. So here's a slide just to help us to understand a concept, right? It's social cohesion. I'm not presuming we don't know it or do know it, but here's a slide to see. I think it's a great concept that I think we need to understand. It's Western, right? But I see resonance with it from an Indigenous perspective. This is the dude that sort of originated it, who was really an interesting person to read and think about. Anyway, so there's lots here that for some reason more than what we need. And there's lots of research to think about in terms of great ways to work with Indigenous peoples. Brant from the, I don't know if you know Claire Brant. He's an Indigenous psychiatrist who passed away. very wise, from Six Nations. I had the privilege of meeting him when I was just getting into medical training. And he speaks to some concepts of ethics, Indigenous ethics. He highlighting on this slide are some of the components of I say relationalism is an Indigenous ethic that that frames a host of principles that I abide by. He offers a whole host of others that I agree with and that resonate with me. Of this, growing up, my grandparents were the head of the Horn Society, which is the Blackfoot sort of higher religious society, and I would see, and they would speak a lot about kind of these concepts of like non-interference and making sure that we're not competing against each other, and the focus on sharing and all that kind of stuff. All the stories that I would see from seeing my grandparents at work, as well as the grandparents on my dad's side, and that family member, in terms of those family members, in terms of their spirituality and connection to sort of ceremonial aspects in my community, was grounded in these concepts. So when when I read Claire Brandt's article, it just reminds me of what I grew up with and how he was, as a psychiatrist, was trying to make sense of this space. I know it's old, but it's still very strong. And probably it's like there's some updating to be done to really connect to Indigenous ethics and understand it, but it's a space to think about this stuff. And for some reason I have this slide again. Here's back to the care framework, and I will end this presentation in a moment, as I promise. The care framework sort of gives us some direction to say, hey, how do you deal with the social resources that happen and economic resources in the patient's life? First of all, you got to screen, and you got to screen in good ways. And there's ways that can be done that seem like you're blaming the person. There's indirect ways that I think are more aligned with us as Indigenous peoples, and some of those screening approaches we see in the literature. So screen and explore. Acknowledge the impact, because often it seems like if we don't help a person to say, that's a really powerful factor in your life, and I can totally understand why this is happening to you, let's find a way, versus ignoring it and saying, you were responsible for everything you've done, and so therefore there's something wrong, right? That's the message that I think we as Indigenous people hear from society in general, versus there's a context as to why the playing field is unlevel, and this is how it is, and this is a plan for us to work through. So that's the key idea for working through both the social and economic realities. But there's a point here to also think about knowledge, right? Health literacy is a big factor in this resource disparities, and many of my patients and many of the cases that we work through, there's a key issue of understanding, just because of all of those same factors that make it hard for you to have resources in your life. Knowledge is a resource. My sickest patients working downtown Calgary at an urban Indigenous center that I created are the ones that are disconnected from everyday knowledge, everyday learning. We are privileged as healthcare providers and as people who are in this space to gain knowledge and interact with knowledge, and that creates wellness. My patients don't have that privilege often, and it really makes me troubled. How do we facilitate that? And if I can facilitate that in the nature of our interaction, that's great, because I think that will be helpful. If I can advocate it, even better. Advocate for it, even better. Also in Dorothy's case, she has some adverse life experiences. It's similar. Screen for them, acknowledge them, explore, support in some ways. In this case, she's just starting to open up. There's more to her story, but that's the context of the framework. And well, I'm going to have to just end it here. This was a larger presentation that I have been given in the past. I'll show you the concept of colonization and inequity. The community was feeling that the healthcare system really embodies inequity, embodies as a perpetuator of colonization. And if you can see it as in that sense, then you can see steps for you within your healthcare environment to address those things that were super clear. That the expectation of not great treatment, as Dorothy highlights, but particularly what do you do with power and authority? And that's deeper conversations. How do you position yourself? How do you place yourself? How do you address these things, knowing that your patient is... I got my antenna out when I see Western people all the time that they're going to be racist and stereotyping towards me and presume things that are not, and then hold power over me. As a doctor, I push against it. I feel it and see it very explicitly as an Indigenous person, and that's what my patients are saying to me as well. That's what we're looking out for. It's exhausting, and how do we address those things? So there's deep knowledge that we have to work through as healthcare providers in these things. I highlighted a lot of stuff about reciprocity and culture, and the framework talks about ways to do so. So I probably should just end here because I can make it more confusing by just talking and talking and talking. So I made this slide because it's simple just before starting. So thank you for listening. I'm thankful for sharing lots of knowledge that I've been trying to pull together. Thankful for the people that have come to the table across the nation, and thankful for my colleagues to help in shaping this knowledge. This knowledge is a big, broad set of it's not simple. It's a narrative in this way still doesn't provide the best way to access it. It's best done in a very talk fashion, so you can see and hold and work through cases in a supportive way. But this is a narrative that's it's linear, but it's an entry point into some complexities that I advocate for, that we need to have as ways of doing in the way that we do our work as clinicians, making for quality care.
Do you agree we should include elders within our healthcare model? I believe they are crucial as a medical doctor and prove beneficial in combating the health disparities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Are there any specific ways you would advocate to include Indigenous elders within our healthcare teams?
Oh yeah, super. So in BC, they've been exploring the role of the elder as a knowledge keeper, so as a knowledge facilitator. So that's where I see the opportunity. So when thinking about access to culture, what does that mean? How does ceremony, how does Indigenous ways of knowing influence wellness, and how do we help a person to get there? It's not through a Western trained doctor, that's for sure, right? But if a Western health system wants to be able to see it and say, yeah, that's a good thing, we need to have a relationship with those holders of that knowledge and the processes in which that knowledge is exchanged. So formally trained traditionalist is kind of the concept, right? Somebody that has a formality of understanding the processes of ceremony, that's deeply connected to a traditional knowledge base, that has had a role, in doing and then a role in teaching others. So those are specific domains of that when I speak to my elders, that they recognize all other sort of ceremonialists as, like some do not have that privilege, and they still respect those people, but they see that these people that have had a historical engagement as a formal ceremonialist means a lifelong learning and a lifelong interchange. They see those as they see those as explicitly as technicians that can help to that interface within a healthcare system. So I've been pushing for these individuals to be a part of our clinic, that and we have that model is a space for Indigenous people to be able to explore Indigenous concepts and ways of connecting with each other that I think mirrors that reciprocity and that relationship, that helps a person not just to think through and make connections cognitively, but also, that interconnectedness from the simplicity of having a ceremony within the clinic. So you can smudge, or you can understand an offering and do an offering with tobacco later, or connect more broadly. There's a big picture of resilience that comes from. I think that is the relationship that our healthcare system needs to understand. I know that in Ontario they have formalized traditional healers, and that's super cool too. I fully advocate that, and they're a system within a system that have come together. They've negotiated the relationship. And my basic concept from my work is around systems. I host I'm the lead for a Indigenous primary healthcare and policy research network, aside from this diabetes stuff, which is a bigger project than this diabetes stuff. We're trying to understand those components of system from an Indigenous lens, and what are those things that we have to shift. I would say that the incorporation is not a right word. It is a relationship of parallel systems. And how can these two parallel systems, which I advocate for the knowledge keeper role, because it seems to fit within a bigger, broader concept that more people have access to, that we can have that parallelism within our healthcare system, which would mean that in our case at the Elbow River Healing Lodge, we explicitly have these elders as facilitators of cultural interchange, connection to that bigger, broader creator through ceremony, as also connection to concepts, Indigenous ways of knowing through the understanding of that traditionalist. So that's how I see. There's lots of things in a system to sort through in terms of the mandates and payment and all that cool stuff, but it's feasible. I would say that is a good start. There's lots of complexity around a traditional healing component that has whether it's a herbal-based medicine or spiritual medicine. That's a complex conversation that I think one has to make sense of locally, because my Southern Alberta conversations may not be relevant to Northern Ontario or Northern BC, because here in Southern Alberta, the traditionalists feel that they are an important layer to protect those specific healers, and the healers are very few in number, while the traditionalists are more in number, and they have interaction with each other and they have relationship. But these traditional healers, they are often very not willing to come to the table, because they feel knowledge is being taken and will be taken by Western care providers, and I fully agree. So the ceremonialists are feeling they are a buffer and a supporter and an interchange. So it takes a long time in my neck of the woods to build that relationship. Some of the other communities have more abilities to come to the forefront on this, but it is a very complex sort of systems shift in order to do this. I look to other places across Canada, also across the world. There's places across the world where Indigenous traditional healers are the mainstay frontline workers. So if you go to South America, Indigenous traditional healers are the primary care physicians, because there are no physicians down there. They're Indigenous traditional healers doing what I do day to day, and the Indigenous person sees them for first and foremost for everything. And that's a whole paradigm shift. But up in Canada, it's a different story. Anyway, long-winded answer to a great question.
All right, we have two more. We'll see if we can quickly grab these last two questions. So one is about whether, in your opinion, this information should be made mandatory to the learning and training of all sectors of healthcare providers across the country, and how?
Yes. Okay. So one needs incentives, and one needs sort of components, requirements for maintaining licensure, right? And I would say that so that's a local context, right? In order to do that, your local licensing body for your profession. So if you're a nursing or a physician, your licensing body needs to incorporate these as policies, and then needs to offer the resources for you to achieve them. So I would say yes, people need to have a certain number of hours of quality Indigenous health education yearly to maintain their license. And if that's not the case, then it needs to be the case. And that's, I think, hopefully what we're moving towards in each of our provincial licensing bodies. Unfortunately, there's no national standards, because that's not how we work in Canada or anywhere. There has to be a regionalism, and that has to be moved. So if a local organization can move it, then the rest of us will hopefully follow suit. There are national licensing bodies for trainees, for family medicine trainees, postgraduate trainees, or medical students. You can have a national sort of requirements. Yes, that's in the works. The Royal College has mandated all specialists have to have certain types of education. The type of education is in question. I argue that I see a lot of education out there. It's pretty good, right? And a lot of it's okay. But not everybody can have that high level pretty good stuff or that high level excellent stuff. I know that what I gave is very didactic today. That's not really how we teach it. It's really this is experiential and case based, right? And it relies on a host of people in the room to learn from each other and learn from their strengths as well as learn from their gaps. I rely on a group dynamic. I rely on that person to say, I don't believe this, Dr. Crowshoe. This doesn't work in my practice. And I rely on everybody else to say, oh, come on, we do it all the time and it's feasible. What is your problem? And let's explore that. It relies on a deep democratic process that is learner-centered. It's focused on explicit educational methods and pedagogies that incorporate Indigenous sort of perspectives into it. This was a didactic. That's not how we teach, but it was a way to transmit some info. This is high-level learning. To get to this point, for you to truly be able to engage, you'd have to be people like you that have extensive experience working with Indigenous peoples and be willing for a learning of this level. I try to give this to undergrad students, and they're like, it's well above their heads. They don't understand. So what you have at hand here is a complex interplay of population health knowledge, clinical knowledge, biomedical knowledge, that's not clinical knowledge, social sciences knowledge, and Indigenous knowledge. And then I'm asking you as a learner to explore some complexities which are mostly outside of what you've been trained. So one needs to be an advanced learner to like connect to E4E. I think each of the provinces, well, at least two of the provinces, has some relatively great basic knowledge that I think one should have. So yes to that. And then when a person wants to go deeper into diabetes work, E4E is a knowledge base to help facilitate you to have another level of expertise. In order to get there, I think we have to have different models of delivery and support for people, because the framework is complex, but also simple. But in order to like make sense of it, you have to utilize it, and you have to have some coaching and some feedback to do it. And so a small group, a case-based approach is a starting point. There's a facilitative process that I think is also needed. That is part of future work that we'll have to do together. So, long-winded answer again. There you go.
Wonderful, thank you. We're just at 2:30, but there's one last question if we can just really quickly get to, because someone shared their own story here, that she's been using Labrador tea for almost a year, along with careful diet changes for her diabetes with great results. And she wonders, do you advocate for traditional medicine, such as juniper and Labrador for diabetes?
So personally, yes. Framework, yes. The framework is kind of hints at like, So the conversations within the framework speaks to that many Indigenous people have huge barriers to traditional medicines and traditional knowledge, and that across Canada, because of colonization, we are seeking but often can't get to that point. So the framework really talks about that social justice, but then highlights that there are many ways for healing within Indigenous context, and that we should not get in the way as clinical providers, but we should be facilitators and advocates in order for you to do so. So my first response is, that's great, that's awesome, 100% supportive. That's like part of the world that I live in as a person, and a part of the world that I advocate for as a clinician. In terms of this model of care, our role as clinicians is to help people to facilitate access to that, knowing that there are many barriers to access. Like many people, like urban context, don't have that privilege. How can I help that urban person who is so disconnected from knowledge and community and indigenous ways of being and knowing, to like get to that space of wellness and healing that our Indigenous ways help? So that's the complexity that I'm asking people to take this and who are clinicians to navigate. There are many barriers because of colonization, and this is one of them. What's your job? How can you help with that? And how can you do that job if you don't even know about it? And now that you do, what will you do? So that's all I'm asking.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. It's been so lovely to have you with us this afternoon.